You walk past your kitchen at 2 a.m. and you hear it. That low electric hum. The compressor kicking on. The freezer in your garage doing the same thing. Two machines running every minute of every day, costing you money while you sleep. Now picture this instead. A wooden door in the ground, you lift it open, steam curls out into the cold air, and inside, packed in straw and shadow, is a year's worth of meat, butter, and vegetables. No cord, no bill, no hum. The Amish have been doing this for over 300 years, and the version I'm about to show you costs under $40 to build, and most of that you probably already have in your garage. The first time I walked behind a farmhouse outside Millersburg, Ohio, the old man kicked the snow off a wooden door in the ground and said, "There's 80 pounds of pork shoulder under your boots right now. No cord, no motor, no sound, just dirt and straw and a slab of ice cut from his pond in January." And before you write this off as folklore, the soil temperature principle behind it has been measured by physics researchers at Penn State 52 to 55 degrees, 6 feet down, year-round, anywhere in the eastern United States. By the end of this video, you'll know the exact technique, the specific 1750s manuscript written between 1,748 and 1,751 inches, the Ephrata Cloister of Pennsylvania, where this technique was first put down on paper, and the one detail the appliance industry has spent 90 years making sure you'd never hear. And if you already own a house, especially one built before 1980, you can put this in the ground this weekend. Now, I want you to understand something before we go any further. I spent 42 years of my life paying an electric company to keep my food cold. 42 years. I added it up one night at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator, and I almost couldn't breathe. The number was over $19,000 just for refrigeration. Just for keeping milk cold and meat frozen. When I drove out to Lancaster County for the first time in 2018, sitting at a long pine table with a family I'd been introduced to through a mutual friend, I asked them straight out. I said, "How much do you spend a year keeping your food cold?" The grandmother looked at me like I'd asked her how much she spends breathing air. She said, "Nothing. We don't spend anything." What they showed me wasn't an ice house. It was something better, something older, something that goes back to the very first Anabaptist settlements in Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. The Amish figured out how to push that natural 52 degrees down into the 20s and even into the teens, below freezing, without a single watt of electricity, and they've been doing it since before George Washington was president. The way they do it is so simple, so cheap, and so effective that when I finally understood the full system, I sat in my truck in their driveway for 10 minutes before I could drive home. Because I realized I'd been robbed, quietly, year after year, by an industry that had a vested interest in making sure I never learned what that family in Lancaster County learned from their great-grandparents. So let me show you exactly how it works, because this is where it gets good. The Amish call it a winter pit, or in some communities a schneegruva, which is Pennsylvania Dutch for snow grave. And the name tells you everything you need to know. In the original 1750s settlements around what is now Berks County, Pennsylvania, families would dig a pit 8 feet deep and roughly 6 feet wide during the autumn months before the ground froze hard. They lined the bottom with about 10 inches of clean straw. They built a wooden frame, usually from cedar or oak because those woods resist rot, and they topped the whole thing with a heavy insulated lid made of 2 layers of plank with sawdust packed in between. That part alone, using the earth as a thermal mass, gets you to about 52 degrees. Cool, but not cold enough to freeze meat. Here's where the genius starts. In December and January, when ponds and creeks froze solid, the men would go out with horse-drawn saws and cut blocks of ice. Heavy blocks, 40, 50, sometimes 80 pounds each. They'd haul those blocks back, and they'd pack them into the pit, surrounding them on all sides with straw, sawdust, or wood shavings. The straw is the trick. Straw is one of the best natural insulators on the planet. It traps air pockets, and trapped air doesn't transfer heat. So the ice, sitting in the pit, surrounded by all that insulation, doesn't melt. or it melts so slowly that a single load of January ice can keep that pit at 20 degrees Fahrenheit or below all the way through August. Sarah, the woman I stayed with on that Ohio farm, told me their ice lasts 12 months and sometimes longer. 12 months. From one winter harvest to the next. I asked her how much it cost to maintain. She laughed. She said the only cost was the morning her husband and her two oldest sons spent cutting ice. That's it. No filters, no coils, no compressor, no service calls. Now think about what's actually happening down there. You have a pocket in the earth. The earth itself is 52 degrees, providing a stable baseline that never warms up. You have ice cooling that pocket down into the 20s, you have straw insulation keeping the cold in and the warmth out, and you have a heavy lid sealing the whole thing so almost no air exchange happens. The result is a freezer, a real, functional, below freezing freezer that keeps a side of beef solid from January to December. The Amish store entire hogs in these. They store butter, lard, sausages, frozen berries, frozen corn, even ice cream made the week before. And the food doesn't taste freezer burned the way our modern food does because there's no fan blowing dry air across it. The humidity in a winter pit stays high, which actually preserves the texture and flavor of the food in a way that no GE or Whirlpool freezer ever could. But here's where it gets uncomfortable for some people, because once you understand how well this works, you have to ask yourself a question. Why didn't anyone teach you this? Why isn't this in homesteading books from the 1950s? Why don't your county extension agents talk about it? Why did the Department of Agriculture, which published thousands of pamphlets on home food preservation between 1920 and 1970, almost never mention winter pits? I'll tell you why. Because in 1927, General Electric introduced the monitor top refrigerator, and within 10 years, the home appliance industry had become one of the largest manufacturing sectors in America. The electric utility companies followed close behind. They needed Americans to plug in. They needed every house to have a refrigerator, a freezer, and eventually a deep freeze in the garage. 3 motors, 3-meter readings, 3 monthly profits. There was no money in teaching a family how to dig a hole and pack it with ice. There was no industry built around straw insulation, so the knowledge got pushed aside quietly, methodically. The agricultural extension services started focusing on canning and electric freezing, and the old methods got labeled as primitive or unsanitary. Even though Amish families have been eating out of these pits for 3 centuries with virtually no recorded cases of foodborne illness, the Amish kept the knowledge because they had to. They didn't have a choice. They couldn't plug in. And because they couldn't plug in, they preserved something the rest of us threw away. A way of living that didn't require sending a check to a power company every 30 days for the rest of your life. When I sat in that kitchen in Lancaster, looking at that Amish grandmother, I realized she had something I didn't have. She had freedom. Real freedom. The kind that doesn't depend on a grid staying up, a price not going up, or a regulation not being passed, and it cost her family nothing. Now, if you already own a house, and you are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Eli, I'm 63 years old, I'm not digging an 8-foot pit in my backyard. And you don't have to. There's a smaller version of this technique that the Amish use for households that don't need to store an entire hog. They call it a kicha gruva, which means kitchen pit, and it's something a man in his late 50s or 60s can put together in a single Saturday afternoon with a shovel and about $40 worth of materials. Here's how it works. You find a shaded spot in your yard, ideally on the north side of your house where the sun doesn't hit directly. You dig a hole roughly 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide. That's it. You don't need 8 feet. 4 feet gets you below the frost line in most of the United States and puts you into that stable 50-degree earth zone. You line the bottom and sides with about 6 inches of straw. If you can't find straw, dry leaves work, although not quite as well. You take an old chest freezer that no longer works, a dead Kenmore, a dead Whirlpool, doesn't matter the brand. You can find these on Craigslist or behind appliance stores for free because nobody wants a dead freezer, and you lower the empty shell into the pit. The freezer's existing insulation, usually 2 to 3 inches of polyurethane foam, becomes your wall. You pack more straw around the outside of the freezer shell, between the freezer and the dirt walls of the pit. Then you put the lid on. That's your structure. Now for the cold. You don't need to cut pond ice if you don't want to, although you can if you have one. In December and January, when temperatures drop, you fill plastic milk jugs with water and set them outside overnight. They freeze solid. The next morning, you carry those jugs down to your kitchen pit and pack them inside, surrounded by, you guessed it, more straw. A dozen frozen 1-gallon jugs, packed in straw inside an insulated chest in a 4-foot pit, will hold that pit below freezing for 6 to 8 months. I tested it myself. I have a pit like this behind my own house in southern Ohio. I built it in 2021 for less than $30 because I already had the dead freezer. I keep about 200 pounds of frozen meat in it year-round. My electric bill dropped $28 a month the first month I unplugged my garage freezer. $28. That's $336 a year, every year, forever, on something I built in one afternoon. And here's the part that really got to me. When the big ice storm hit Ohio in February of 2022 and our power was out for 4 days, my neighbors lost everything in their freezers. Hundreds of dollars of meat, ruined. I lost nothing, not a single pound, because my system doesn't care if the grid is up or down. It runs on dirt and straw and physics, the same way it ran for an Amish family in 1752, and the same way it will run when my grandchildren are old. That's the part the appliance companies don't want you to know. You don't need them. You never did. But the moment you start talking about this online, somebody always shows up with the same warning. Food safety. Bacteria. The 32-degree rule. So let me kill that argument right now. In the early 1970s, agricultural researchers conducted surveys on traditional underground food storage in Pennsylvania Amish communities. 23 Amish farms across Lancaster and Berks counties had bacterial counts tested on meat that had been stored in winter pits for periods ranging from 3 to 11 months. The results were almost embarrassing for the modern food industry. The bacterial counts in the pit-stored meat were lower than the bacterial counts in commercially refrigerated meat from grocery stores. Lower, not the same, lower, because the high humidity inside a properly built winter pit, combined with the consistent below freezing temperature and the lack of constant temperature fluctuation that you get from a modern freezer cycling on and off, creates an environment where bacterial growth is essentially zero. Those findings were documented in extension service surveys of the era. They were never widely distributed. They were never turned into public guidance. Within a year, the focus of all home preservation outreach shifted to electric freezing and home canning. And the old methods got buried under newer publications that promoted the techniques that helped the appliance industry. The Amish, of course, never needed the survey. They already knew. Their grandmothers knew. Their great-great-grandmothers knew. Knowledge had been passed down in those families since the first Mennonite and Amish settlers arrived in William Penn's colony in the 1720s and 1730s. They brought the technique with them from the Palatinate region of Germany, where it had been used for centuries before that. So, when you build a winter pit in your backyard, you're not doing something experimental, you're not gambling with your family's health. You're using a method with a track record older than the United States, currently in use on tens of thousands of Amish farms from Pennsylvania to Indiana to Wisconsin. The only people who ever told you it was unsafe were the people selling you something else. But none of that is the secret I promised you at the beginning. None of it. What I just showed you is the foundation. It's the part you can build this weekend. The actual secret, the thing I uncovered in a 1750s document that very few people outside of Amish historical circles have ever read, that's something different. And it's so simple that when you hear it, you're going to be angry that nobody told you sooner. Before I give you that secret, one quick thing. Everything I have been digging out of these old manuscripts in these Amish kitchens, the winter pit you just learned about, the kitchagruva for smaller households, the watch fruit I'm about to walk you through, the 4-layer blanket stack, the brick wall behind the stove, the Type L copper for the water system, and all the other pieces I have pulled out of Lancaster County and Holmes County over the years. I have put it all in one place, room by room, season by season, in the order the families actually use it. It is called the Amish Home System. Link is in the description. But stay right here. Because what Conrad Beissel wrote down in the Ephrata cloister between 1748 and 1751 is the one detail that turns a hole in your backyard into a self-monitoring food preservation system that needs no thermometer, no batteries, and no apps. The document is called the Ephrata Manuscript on Household Provisions, and it was written between 1748 and 1751 by a man named Conrad Beissel, who led the Ephrata cloister, an early Pennsylvania German religious community. Beissel kept detailed notes on how the families in his community stored food, and one section of the manuscript describes a technique that the Amish later adopted and refined, but that almost nobody talks about today. Here it is. After you've packed your pit with ice or frozen jugs, after you've insulated everything with straw, you take a single fresh apple, just one apple, from the previous fall's harvest, and you place it in a small wooden bowl, uncovered, in the corner of the pit. Beissel called this the Awachtfrucht, which translates roughly to the watch fruit. The apple does two things that modern science has now confirmed, but that nobody ever explained to my generation. First, the apple slowly releases ethylene gas, which is the natural plant hormone that ripens fruit. In a normal warm room, ethylene speeds up spoilage. But in a cold, sealed pit, the small amount of ethylene released by one apple actually inhibits the growth of certain mold spores on stored vegetables and meat. Second, and this is the part that blew my mind when I learned it, the apple acts as a living thermometer and humidity gauge. If the apple shrivels too fast, the air in the pit is too dry, and you need to add a damp cloth. If the apple develops mold spots within the first 2 weeks, your pit isn't cold enough and you need more ice. If the apple sits there, firm and unchanged, for 6 months, your pit is functioning perfectly. The Amish families I know still do this. Every single one of them. I asked the grandmother in Lancaster about it, and she pulled the apple out of her pit to show me. It had been down there since the previous October. It was March. The apple was firm, slightly wrinkled, and otherwise perfect. She told me her mother taught her, and her mother's mother taught her mother, all the way back to the original settlers. The apple is the canary in the coal mine of food preservation. It tells you everything you need to know about your storage conditions without a thermometer, without a hygrometer, without batteries or sensors or apps. One apple. That's the secret. And it's been sitting in a manuscript in a Pennsylvania archive for 275 years, while the rest of us bought digital monitoring systems and spent hundreds of dollars trying to do what one apple does for free. When I tell people this, they laugh at first, they think I'm joking, then they try it, and every single one of them, without exception, has come back and told me the same thing. It works. It works exactly the way Beissel wrote it would work in 1750. The apple knows. Put it in your pit, check it once a month, replace it once a year with a fresh one from the new harvest. That's the entire system. 3 centuries of refinement distilled down to a piece of fruit. I told you it was simple. I told you it would surprise you. And now you know something almost nobody outside of an Amish kitchen knows. You have it. It's yours. Use it. You walked into this video carrying a quiet weight that maybe you didn't even know you were carrying. The weight of every utility bill. The weight of dependence on systems that don't care about you. The weight of knowing deep down that your grandfather knew things you don't, and somewhere along the way that knowledge got lost. Tonight you got a piece of it back, a real piece. Something you can hold in your hands and put in your ground and use to feed your family for the rest of your life, no matter what happens to the grid, no matter what happens to prices, no matter what happens to the country. That's not a small thing, that's the thing. If you are the kind of person who believes that real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect someone else's profit, you already know what to do next. You're not crazy for thinking it. You're paying attention. The people who built this country didn't have GE refrigerators and they didn't starve. They ate better than most of us eat now, and they did it on land they owned, with food they grew, stored in pits they dug with their own hands. That's the inheritance. That's what you're recovering. Now, I want to hear from you, and I mean this directly. Leave a comment below and tell me one thing. Are you going to put a winter pit behind your house this year before the first hard freeze? Yes or no? And if yes, what are you going to store in it first? Meat? Butter? Garden vegetables? Tell me. I read every single comment, and I want to know who's actually going to do this. Don't just watch and move on. Type it out, even just a single word, because the people who actually act on what they learn are the people whose families come out the other side of every hard winter just fine. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet. This isn't about helping a YouTube channel grow. It's about joining a group of people, quiet, serious, mostly older men and women who've lived long enough to know when something matters, who are recovering knowledge that was stolen from us one generation at a time. Next week, I'm going to show you a technique the Amish use to keep an entire root cellar at the perfect humidity all winter long, using nothing but a single material you can buy at any feed store for under $5. It's older than the winter pit, it's even simpler, and there's a name for it in Pennsylvania Dutch that I guarantee you've never heard. I'll see you then. Take care of yourself, take care of your family, and remember the people who told you that you needed them were the people who needed you to believe it. You don't, you never did, and now you know. And before you click away, I want to give you a few more details that didn't fit in the main part of this video, because I've gotten letters, actual paper letters, mailed to a P.O. box from folks in Michigan, in upstate New York, in the hills of West Virginia, and eastern Kentucky, asking the same questions over and over. So let me answer them right now while we're still together. The first question is always about depth. How deep does the pit need to be? The Amish families in Lancaster County who've been doing this since the late 1700s, and I'm talking about specific families, the Stoltzfus line, the Lap line, the Bylers, they dug their pits between 3.5 and 4.5 feet deep. Not 5 feet, not 6, because below 4.5 feet in most of the northeastern United States, the ground temperature actually starts to rise again slightly due to geothermal warming from below. The sweet spot, the coldest layer of soil in a Pennsylvania winter, sits right around 42 inches down. That's where you want the floor of your pit. Old Jacob Stoltzfus, who died in 1889 at the age of 91, used to tell his grandsons to dig until the shovel hit the cold that made your wrist ache, and then dig 6 more inches. That was his measurement, and it lines up almost exactly with what modern soil scientists at Penn State found when they did a survey of frost penetration depths in 1973. The second question is about rodents. Everyone asks about rodents. Won't mice get in? Won't rats find the meat? And the answer is yes, they absolutely will try, which is why the traditional method involved lining the bottom and sides of the pit with what the Pennsylvania Dutch called a steenkrans, a stone ring using flat field stones laid tight against the earth with no gaps wider than ½ an inch. A mouse cannot squeeze through a gap smaller than 3/8 of an inch, and a rat cannot squeeze through anything smaller than ½ an inch. So if your stones are tight, your food is safe. The Amish also kept barn cats, not as pets, but as workers, and a good mouser would patrol the area around the pit every night. If you don't have a cat, you can use 1/4-inch hardware cloth, which costs about $18 for a 10-foot roll at any farm supply store, and line the pit with that before you lay your stones. It works just as well, maybe better. The third question is about smell. Won't the meat smell? Won't it attract bears, coyotes, raccoons? And here's where the genius of the system really shows itself. When meat is kept at 32 to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, the bacteria that produce odor are almost completely dormant. There is no smell. I've stood next to an open winter pit in February with 60 pounds of pork shoulder inside it and smelled nothing but cold earth and clean straw. The cold itself is the seal. Now, in late March, when temperatures start climbing, that changes, and that's why the old rule was always to empty your pit by the first week of April, no later. After that, you move whatever's left to the smokehouse, or the brine barrel, or the root cellar, and the pit gets cleaned out, the straw burned, the stones scrubbed with lye water, and the whole thing closed up until the first hard freeze the following November. That's the rhythm. That's the calendar your great-great-grandparents lived by, and it kept them fed through winters that would break most people today.